Here are some additional points to undo the obfuscation of law and order. Like I said in part one, the key thing to understand with this idea of law and order, first of all, is that as far as a moral law goes, there really is only one legitimate moral law, and it's exactly what the Messiah, Yeshua, taught us when he pointed us to the greatest commandments. That is a law of comprehensive love, which is simultaneously a law against abuse, which is the opposite of love. So that's utilizing the law of logic that something cannot coexist with its opposite. So, therefore, if the commandment is to love, it logically holds that it is simultaneously a law against its opposite, which is abuse. So, focusing on the word order again, the only rational way to interpret that word is to think of it as representing defensive force. So the law is a law against abuse, and the order or the enforcement of that law can only rationally be defensive force. And the reason for that is if the order is abusive itself, well, then that is not in the law against abuse, right? So the law is no abuse is acceptable at any time in any scenario, and the enforcement of that law or the order being carried out is necessarily non-abusive. In other words, defensive force, because defensive force, when it is appropriate, when it's justified, and when it's proportional to the violence being committed, is not at all abusive. It's actually an act of love. It's actually just carrying out the law. If someone is harming you or someone else nearby, and you use proportional defensive force to end the violence, to stop the violence, that's actually an act of love. There's nothing abusive about it, as long as it's not excessive and as long as the person really was committing an act of violence. Right? It has to be true defensive force, and it has to be proportional, and that is true order. So the true law, again, is a law against abuse, and true order is defensive force. That's the truth about law and order, which has not been explained to us, right? And the reason why it hasn't been explained clearly like that is because people that want to carry out abuse rely on the obfuscation, the muddying of the waters of clarity on what is really justice and what is actually injustice. So the main way this has been accomplished is by not recognizing that order is actually defensive force. It's actually the enforcement of the law of love or the non-abuse principle. But they've been led to believe that order is just the enforcement of whatever law, whatever state, whatever politician, whatever government makes, whatever they write on a piece of paper and say this is the law, that being enforced equals order. But that's not true in a legitimate sense, because order and abuse are actually not compatible. They can't coexist. But people have been duped into thinking that not having abusive control, i.e., anarchy, not having abusive rulers, equals disorder, or in other words, abuse. So if you recognize actually that order is in a condition of love or an enforcement of love, and disorder is the carrying out of abuse, then simply saying that we should not have abusive rulers is certainly not promoting disorder, because it's against abuse. So, a true law enforcer is any person using defensive force justifiably and proportional to the real violence committed, like I said previously. That is a law enforcer who's obeying the true law and who is supporting real order in society. But since aggression is a form of abuse and is the initiation of violence, that can never be a legitimate law, and it can never be legitimately called law enforcement. So anything that actually initiates the violence first against a person or a population is an illegitimate law, and it's not true law enforcement. So things like red flag laws, things like medical tyranny, coercing people to take whatever drugs the state says you should take, lockdowns, right, restricting travel, curfews, all these kind of things, closing down businesses, all as a preemptive attack, all examples of initiating violence against people, initiating abuse of control in the name of safety, in the name of the greater good. But you can't say it's actually really promoting safety or the good of society, because it's an act of violence. And again, it's important to recognize the simplicity of the truth concerning law and order and concerning real justice and morality. Abuse is never acceptable. It doesn't matter what crisis is occurring, real, exaggerated, or manufactured or fake. There's no excuse for it. It's never actually a legitimate response, because, again, it violates the law, the only true moral law. And all of the preemptive attacks carried out by the state are, of course, founded on the abuse of extortion, otherwise known as taxation. And saying we need to accept the abuse disorder of extortion to provide security for the poor, that's an objection people will make. They'll say, well, if we don't accept taxation, then what about people that can't afford a security service, or can't afford weaponry to defend themselves and their family? So the problem with that argument is that one, it's accepting preemptive attack as legitimate. Two, it's assuming that this poor person actually is okay with this extortion taking place. For example, the income tax, being taken out of every paycheck. Obviously it's a small paycheck, and so the taxes that are taken out are significantly, damaging, more so than it would be to a rich person. So it's assuming that they're okay with this arrangement, first of all. And it's also irrational because the money is being taken from them even though they're poor. So why couldn't they use that money to, like, say, purchase a gun for themselves or pay for some other security service? Why is the fact that they're still having to pay ignored, as if they're getting this free service? It's not free if they're having the money taken from them via extortion. Another kind of argument, people will say something along the lines of, well, it's necessary to prevent the greater evil of what might happen without this extortion-based security service. So it's assuming somehow that extortionists are the only good protection service possible, and that just doesn't make any sense. Why would the only people on earth that could be a good protection service, why is it that they must be also extortionists? That doesn't make any sense. Actually, it contradicts itself. Why would you think someone committing an actual crime in the moral sense would be the best protection against crime? It's like thinking the mafia is the best protection service. Why would you look to someone who's engaging in a criminal activity constantly every day? Why would you see them as the best, and not only the best, but the only form of good security? It just doesn't make any sense. Additionally, say someone doesn't want any security service at all, and you could argue reasonably, like, well, that's going to be really risky for them. But say they understand that it's going to be riskier, and they're not concerned about it, or they would rather just live a riskier life where they have more freedom and they can keep all their money. You might say, well, that's pretty foolish, but who are you to make that choice for them? If someone wants, quote unquote, dangerous freedom, why are they not entitled to that? If you say that you can make the decision for them, it's like you're looking at them like either they're your child, which they're not, right? If it's a grown adult, another individual, or you're looking at them like they're your livestock that you can control as you see fit, right? So you're looking down at them in a master-slave dynamic, right? You're looking at them as if they're your slave and you're the master somehow, which is not at all legitimate. If someone doesn't want to pay for security service, well, sure, you could say that puts them at higher risk, but again, who are you to determine the choice of, security versus risk for someone else's life? That's their choice, not yours. Another counter argument is basically this idea that ethics changes when the scale is increased, when you're talking about more than just one or two or a few people. When you get to some arbitrary number, let's just say 10,000 people, when you get to that number, well, now things are different. And so now, it's justifiable to treat those people like livestock, put them under a system of extortion, have rulers, have these laws which are abusive put in place, all in the name, again, of safety and the greater good. But how does that actually make sense? How is it that it would be wrong to abusively control one person, but it somehow becomes legitimate to abusively control thousands or millions of people? And oftentimes this is communicated in the context of what they call the small country problem. Well, they'll say, we can't just have, sovereign individuals who are not abusively controlled, and instead live in voluntary community. We can't have that because then they would be victimized by some larger country. So the main blunder here, along with thinking that abuse has some exception, again, so this is just yet another example of people thinking there's an exception to the rule. It's like, oh, abuse is normally not okay, but if there's a crisis, it's acceptable, or if they just say safety 500 times, or if there's some health issue going on, then it's acceptable. If there's any kind of crisis, it's acceptable. Or if we're talking about a large population, then suddenly it becomes legitimate. But again, this just overlooks the reality that society is made up of individuals. And if you're talking about one state taking over another state, you're talking about one government interfering with another government, why are you equating that with the individual again? It's actually conflating governments with individuals, saying, oh, well, it's wrong for one individual to be abusive to another individual, but because there's these large governments in the world, we have to actually enforce abuse towards all the individuals to prevent them from being abused from some larger government. Again, this just gets back to the fact that if someone doesn't want to support a particular security service, and just calling a government simply a security service is, not accurate, since they do a lot more than provide security. They actually, like I've been saying, do a lot of things that are abusive, which is not promoting a state of security. If you're being abused, you're not actually safe. And of course, there's all kinds of other destruction and violence that governments perpetrate, democide being a huge example. Various wars that are unjustified, that kill millions of civilians, right? All kinds of destructive things go on. So why is it that this so-called, security service, or that their whole existence is based on the fact that they do provide a security service to some extent, why is that seen as their legitimization? Why is that an exception to the only true law? And there's no good answer to that. So I hope you found some of these points compelling, and that you'll question the so-called intelligence and wisdom and necessity of, quote unquote law and order, which is really just a violation of the true law, which causes disorder. It's a violation of the law of love, which causes disorder. because abuse is a manifestation of disorder. Right? You have to get in your head that disorder equals abuse. And so therefore, law enforcement that's abusive is a contradiction in terms. Listening.